I always give the analogy of a physical wound. If you got a small scratch on your hand and then just let time heal it, it probably will heal on its own, right? But if every day you're pouring poison on that even small scratch, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to get worse. So what do I mean by pouring poison? Well, the narrative that you have going on in your head, the negative self-talk, the negative narrative about the grief and loss and trauma, that is pouring poison on any size wound.
I am mentally strong, learn it, live it, level up, regardless what life brings. I will live mentally strong.
Another lie that we're told, maybe even tell yourself, is that time heals all wounds. Not true. I'm Dr. B. I have lost 3 children and my husband. I have grief and trauma wounds that will not heal themselves. How do you actually grieve? How do you work through the pain? An emotional wound is the pain that you're experiencing. I always give the analogy of a physical wound. If you got a small scratch on your hand and then just let time heal it, it probably will heal on its own, right? But if every day you're pouring poison on that even small scratch, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to get worse. So what do I mean by pouring poison? Well, the narrative that you have going on in your head, the negative self-talk, the negative narrative about the grief and loss and trauma, that is pouring poison on any size wound. So what if it was a big wound, like losing children, losing your husband, being traumatized in some way, right? If you are pouring emotional poison on that wound, it is only going to get worse. Think about a big physical wound, right? That, let's say you got shot in the abdomen and it is this big gaping wound. You obviously need to take care of it. It can heal. You will likely always have a scar, but it can heal and you can be healthy. But there's things that you have to do to make that big wound heal. So time does not heal all wounds. Time and not pouring poison into it or on it can heal small wounds, but it's not going to heal big wounds, big emotional wounds. I understand big emotional wounds. And in the midst of that, I created the Mentally Strong method. And this is what I teach. Like, do you have a system for mental strength? Regardless of what you've been through, can you say, I am mentally strong? And I hope that you can find the inner strength, find the self-agency to work through that. When I talk about the Mentally Strong method, and I'm not going to go into detail in this video, there's other videos around the Mentally Strong method. I talk about, can you think through your problems? Can you organize them? And can you make choices in line with what you want? And many times life is just hitting us over and over and over again. If you know my story, I lost my first son in a drowning accident in 2005. Shortly after that, my son Reggie started having catastrophic epilepsy. He had 10 years of medical trauma before he passed in 2016. And then my daughter, who although had the same disorder as my son, she was not sick, died in her sleep. And then my husband succumbed to the same disorder in hospice 5 years later. Grief is part of my story, but I have not allowed it to ruin my life. And so how do we do that? Well, I'm going to go through, in this video, we're going to go through questions. And the first question is, how does mental strength apply to grief when you cannot simply think your way out of pain? we talk about mental strength as a whole in our community, right? As resilience and grit and pushing through. And you cannot just push through this kind of pain. And unfortunately, we have been teaching this thing called the 5 stages of grief, that you somehow with time will go through these 5 stages of grief, and in the end you will have acceptance. Also a lie that we have been told. The research behind the 5 stages of grief was actually a hospice research, right? Like, these are the stages that someone who is dying, not for the person who is left behind. Now, are some of the theory true? Did I experience depression? Did I experience bargaining? Did I experience shock? The word acceptance, which supposedly is the last stage, is a huge trigger for people who have experienced intense grief. So although parts of the 5 stages of grief are true, you don't just go through them naturally and time heals that wound, right? So that's the first thing, acknowledging that grief is part of your story. But what is enmeshed with grief is what is like holding you back from actually processing it and it being a part of your story. So how do we apply it? We don't just think of it as grit. We don't think of it as just time passing, but we actually learn to process grief. How do you process grief? You have to feel the pain. And we also live in a culture where we don't like pain. We have a headache, we take a pain pill. We have any kind of pain, we want it to go away. The pain of grief needs to be felt. It is our story, it is our right, it is our honor to honor the pain of that grief. And so one of the activities in the Mentally Strong method is something called controlled grief, where I prescribe that you actually take the time and sit in your grief. So I have a room in my house that has all of my kids' toys, all of the pictures and memorabilia and some of their clothes. And I will go in there and allow myself to feel that pain. Sometimes I cry. Sometimes I get angry. I'm getting a little teared up now, like thinking about it. And that is okay. That is part of, so if you think about like a soda can that you've shaken up or a teapot that's boiling water and if you hold down the lid, eventually it will explode. But if you slowly open things and let the pressure of this pain of grief release, the intensity and frequency in which you have to feel it will decrease. Now, this is super important when I talk about controlled grief, because in the Mentally Strong method, we actually organize things. That is grief by itself. Very few people have just grief. It is often enmeshed with other things. So for example, with me, it was enmeshed with trauma. My son had 10 years of medical trauma before his passing. And then the morning I found my daughter and did CPR on her was extremely traumatic for me. And then just losing children is trauma by itself. And we know that trauma is stored in the body and will actually manifest in mental and physical symptoms if we don't release that. So, but oftentimes somebody will go to a counselor and they've lost a child and they have this trauma, and the therapist is trying to work through the trauma to release the trauma, right? But it's enmeshed with the grief. And anybody who tries to take away my honor and grief of the pain of my child, I'm going to fight that. I'm not going to let that go. So being able to separate it, say, this is the trauma, I'm going to let that go. This is the grief, I am going to honor this pain. This is my story. And a story of pain and grief that you have felt is different than holding on to trauma. Other things that often get enmeshed is negative self-talk. Like, me saying to myself, I'm a bad mother. I don't, I'm not taking care of my children. I didn't save my children. Like, that's negative self-talk. I could have done something different. Those are things that also get enmeshed with the grief. And then we don't want to let those go. We don't want to change those because we're holding on to our grief. No, that needs to be separated. So you can't just think away your pain. You must organize it, right? So remember I told you, think, organize, choose. So you must organize that pain, and so that you can learn to know what you need to release, what you need to take accountability for, and what you get to honor as your pain. All right, next question. What are the thinking traps that people fall into when grieving that make the process harder than it needs to be? Well, unfortunately, the process is hard. I wish I could tell you, oh, there's these nice 5 stages of grief, and you just do this, this, and this, and you will get through your grief. And it's just not true. And I'm sorry. But when it's enmeshed with those other things, you're unconsciously learning to hold on to trauma, negative self-talk, anxiety, right? Maybe instead of taking accountability for your decisions, you are having guilt and shame. For example, in all 3 cases of losing all 3 of my children, my son, Johnny, died in a drowning accident. I told him to wear a life jacket, but I didn't tell the adults that were going to the river with him. Now, accountability, I could have done better. But if I hold on to that with guilt and shame, that's not grief. So learning to separate that. Same thing with my son. My son was sick the day that he died, and he died at home. And I should have taken him to the emergency room. And I, went through that process of beating myself up for that. But when I can get to a point where I've really organized this and I can take accountability for that, I can really wrestle with the spiritual conflict. Because I said with Maya, I don't care if she's got a cold, she's going to the emergency room. I'm never going to try to handle anything on my own. And then the girl dies in her sleep, right? So it's not always about the choice that you made. And have you worked through those things? Because they need to be worked through separately. Because that was a real spiritual conflict for me, right? And no matter what you believe spiritually, when you lose someone that close to you, you have to wrestle with what you believe happens after death. That's part of the process. So that's what holds people back, that it's all enmeshed. Next, how do you tell the difference between healthy grieving and getting stuck? It's the looping. If you are sitting in looping, you're telling the same story over and over and over again. And it's heavy and it's negative. And there's no clarity or movement in a lighter direction. You might be making yourself stuck. And be careful in traditional talk therapy or just talking with your friends. You can get into these loops where you're not actually expanding. You're not increasing capacity. You're just making the weight heavier and heavier. You don't need to be told. You know if you're stuck. You know if you're stuck. So if you're stuck, take this moment to think, what can I do to get unstuck? And the first is to stop the looping thinking pattern. And I talk about this in the Mentally Strong Method. This looping rumination and overthinking pattern over and over again is just contributing to the stuckness. But if you're asking that question, you probably know if you're stuck. And maybe you've got a little dialogue that's like, I think I'm doing this right. I think I'm working through this, but I'm scared that I'm not. And that's okay. That is a healthy place to be. And just keep going. Keep watching videos. Keep searching. Come to one of my live events and learn what the Mentally Strong Method is. How do you actually have a system for mental strength, regardless what has happened in your life. Okay, the next question is, how does a mentally strong method apply to losses beyond death, like divorce or career ending? So the mentally strong method can be applied to anything. I think mostly it's acknowledging what is grief in your life and what other components are enmeshed with that grief, right? Grief is, remember, a story. It's part of your story. Everybody has grief. Does everybody have grief to the extent that I do? No. But everybody has grief now and will have grief, right? We will all lose someone. It is acknowledging what is grief. And grief, one of the great examples I like to give about grief is I was grieving for my children way before their death. They had a neurodegenerative condition that every time I would try to help them make a goal and reach a goal, we would have to decrease the goal. Every meeting with the school system, I left crying because last year we were going to work on this thing and now we got to work on something lower, right? They never actually met their goals. And that was grief after grief after grief. The day I realized that they would never marry, that was grief. The day I realized that they would never, live on their own, all of those things is grief. And so grief is not just death. It is a loss of an idea, of a dream. I've got a lot of empty nesters listening. It is a loss of what you wanted for your children. So acknowledging it and then using the method to organize what is grief and then what is negative self-talk, anxieties about the future. These all need to be processed and worked through differently. And so that's where the power of choice comes in. Next, what behaviors do mentally strong people avoid when grieving that feel helpful but actually slow healing? I'm going to repeat this. It's the looping. It's the overthinking and looping over and over again. And I'm not talking about the controlled grief, right? Because I will go into that room and I will cry and I will get angry sometimes. And in the beginning, when it was super intense, I was punching on punching bags. You can see that in my documentary. But what stops the healing or slows down the healing is this getting stuck in the thinking part, right? Remember I said think, organize, choose? If we get stuck in the overthinking, looping, and we're not getting to the organizational piece where we can take these things apart and do something about them and then make some choices. So if I had to pick one thing, it would be the looping of the thought process. All right, last question. How do you rebuild your identity and sense of purpose after a loss that fundamentally changes who you are? Losing a spouse, losing a child, losing your sense of safety, which happens in trauma. If you have been physically or sexually abused, you were assaulted, it changes your perception of safety. And how do you rebuild that identity and purpose after loss? That is such an intimate question. The first thing I would say to you is don't give up. Figure out what is the next step, right? Not everyone has the same purpose. Not every time there's a loss, it's the same purpose. And we also have to address, in the Mentally Strong Method, there's a category called spiritual conflict. And we have to address this spiritual conflict of you may never know the earthly purpose to the pain that you've experienced. There's not a silver lining around everything. Life is hard. How do we build a system of mental strength around that? You do it one choice at a time. And if that choice doesn't have some organization behind it, it might not do momentum. So when I teach the Mentally Strong method, it's this think, organize, choose. Think, organize, choose, right? And it's a flywheel. If you know what a flywheel is it's a wheel that creates a momentum, and the more you do it, the easier it gets. And if we can do that, if we can create that momentum, you may be able to communicate the purpose. But when we struggle with what could possibly be the purpose of this, and for me, if you know my story, I do think that the purpose for me is to have an impact on other people. But when I think about that personally, like, who cares, right? Like, this is my pain and it hurts deeply. And so, and I love my children more than anything in this world. I would take them back over helping other people. And I know that sounds selfish, right? So the word purpose is a spiritual word. It is not just, a task or an objective of this earth. It is a deeply spiritual journey that is personal for everyone. And you may never be able to connect the dots that this grief is attached to this purpose. But I challenge you to wrestle with your God about that, because it is definitely part of the journey. So I would love for you to learn the Mentally Strong method. There is a free training that you can watch instantly. You can be invited to a live event where I'm doing like a Mentally Strong method live that costs a tiny bit of money. And then there is I work with people on 90-day programs. I work with people in intensives, and we have coaching programs. We train coaches. Lots of ways to really become a part of the Mentally Strong community. But it starts with clicking the link below. See you there.